In the 80s, it was radical. In the 70s, it was super. In the 60s, it was far out. And in the 50s, it was whatever. They called it in the 50s, golly gee whiz or something. But for the 90s, it was extreme. Everything was extreme. You couldn't walk 5 feet from your house or sit through a single commercial break without the letter X catching your eye. It was the 90s. That's all very fun, but why were teenagers in the 90s obsessed with everything being extreme? Because that decade rejected subtlety and nuance in favor of high volume, high velocity, and high intensity everything. Moderation was out. Restraint was boring. The 90s embraced a more is more attitude. Loud, sweaty, overstimulated, hypercolored, and often punctuated by an unnecessary, aggressive-looking X. This was the golden age of extreme sports, of extreme juice pouches so sugary they felt illegal, of X-Men comics turned movie franchises, of the X Games turning skateboarding and snowboarding into primetime spectacles, and yes, even of the extreme teen Bible, proof that not even religion could escape the trend. In the 90s, extreme wasn't just a word to describe intensity, it was a marketing strategy, a lifestyle, a way to sell you cereal, sneakers, and your own identity. The origins of extreme culture in the 1990s weren't random, and they weren't entirely organic either. They were the result of several overlapping forces, generational angst, shifting cultural norms, and a growing appetite for rebellion that could be safely packaged and sold. At its core, extreme was the product of a collision between youth rebellion, savvy corporate opportunism, and a widespread recalibration of American pop culture in the aftermath of the 1980s.
Yeah, Daria, tell your dad what edgy is.
As far as I can make out, edgy occurs when middle-brow, middle-aged profiteers are looking to suck the energy, not to mention spending money, out of the quote-unquote youth culture. So they come up with this fake concept of seeming to be dangerous when every move they make is the result of market research and a corporate master plan.
I know everyone uses this quote, but I couldn't have said it better myself. The previous decade had been drenched in excess. Glossy commercialism ruled the airwaves, everything was slick and shiny, and consumerism was king. Big hair, pastel suits, and neon leg warmers were visual shorthand for a culture obsessed with appearance, profits, and surface-level style. But as the 90s rolled in, so did a new mood, and it wasn't interested in perfection. In fact, the 90s came in like a cultural correction. Everything slowed down, then flipped. It was as if a generation collectively decided that it had seen through the gloss and wasn't buying it anymore. Grunge music exploded out of Seattle with its flannel-clad nihilism, punk re-emerged from the underground, and hip-hop continued to evolve into a genre of fierce self-expression, often with a raw, unfiltered edge. These forms of music weren't just sounds, they were statements. They rejected artifice. They leaned into discomfort. They valued authenticity, even if it was messy or angry or hard to understand. At the same time, a growing unease with anything that felt fake or too polished started to creep into the mainstream. Teenagers and young adults became more suspicious of ads, brands, and anything that felt too eager to please. But here's the thing, rebellion alone doesn't sell. You can't make $1 billion off punk rock ethics without bending them a little, or a lot. That's where the corporate world stepped in. Marketers, always attuned to the winds of change, saw the shift happening. They recognized the power of attitude and quickly figured out how to repackage it. So instead of fighting against this new, more cynical, more jaded youth culture, advertisers embraced it. They took the rawness of that anti-establishment spirit and carefully shaved off the dangerous edges. They made it louder, shinier, and, most importantly, sellable. What emerged was a version of rebellion that could fit in a soda can or be printed on a cereal box. It was wild, but not too wild. It was dangerous, but never threatening. It had just enough edge to feel cool, but not enough to make anyone uncomfortable. And so, the extreme label was born. Not just as a descriptor, but as a brand strategy. It was the rebellion you could take to the mall, the chaos that came with a safety net, the punk rock energy wrapped in neon packaging. It was a calculated reinvention of cool, created not by artists or outsiders, but by people in boardrooms who knew exactly how to sell chaos back to the kids who thought they invented it. The letter X did a lot of heavy lifting. It wasn't just a stand-in for the word extreme. It became a symbol in its own right. The X meant danger, chaos, attitude, freedom. It was shorthand for rebellion, but also for inclusion in the right kind of rebellion. The one with Mountain Dew ads and branded snowboards. The X promised that this was not your parents' version of fun. It was bigger, louder, faster. Want to make a sport seem cooler to teenagers? Add some rails, a half pipe, maybe a helmet camera, and call it extreme inline skating. Want kids to eat more cereal? Throw in some jagged graphics, neon marshmallows, and a comic book mascot and sunglasses? Now it's breakfast for shredders, not just students. The X wasn't just edgy typography. It was a passport to a louder, riskier, more exciting world. This was also the golden age of the X prefix and suffix, a time when slapping an X on the front or back of any word instantly made it cooler, edgier, and more appealing to a hyper-energized, trend-chasing youth market. Extreme, X-Force, Executioner, Xander. It didn't matter what the product, character, or event actually was. If it had an X in it, it was assumed to be more dangerous, more rebellious, more intense. The X implied mystery, power, and that elusive quality marketers desperately wanted to bottle. Edge. You didn't just invent something new and hope it caught on, you gave it an X to let everyone know it was a next-level innovation. It wasn't just Generation X, it was X. Everything. If you wanted to sound cool in the 90s, there was a formula. Drop some vowels, maybe toss in a Z where an S used to be, and for good measure, add a lightning bolt, flame, or claw mark to the logo. Subtlety was out. Over-design was in. Kids weren't just buying yogurt. They were buying extremely cool slam packs, which came with packaging louder than the actual flavor. Granola bars had extreme crunch. Cheese snacks had extra zing. Even the most basic products were repackaged like they were designed for intergalactic snowboarders. It didn't stop at snacks. The X virus infected everything. TV shows, comic books, toy lines, and video games all doubled down on intense branding. School assemblies had to become multimedia explosions. Youth soccer leagues introduced names like X-Blast tournaments. Even Christian youth groups weren't immune. Sunday school, with its quiet flannel graph Jesus and polite crafts, was suddenly deemed too boring to compete with secular culture. So it got a facelift. Now it was Extreme Discipleship Night, complete with flashing lights, electric guitars, and acronyms about making radical life choices for God. No joke. If church couldn't be cool, at least it could try to sound like motocross. It's no coincidence that the very first X Games exploded onto the scene in 1995. It wasn't just a new sports competition, it was the crystallization of a whole cultural undercurrent that had been brewing throughout the early 90s. Skateboarding, snowboarding, motocross, and BMX weren't invented in the boardrooms of sporting networks. They were born on the cracked asphalt of suburban driveways, in vacant parking lots behind shopping centers, and on icy backyard slopes cobbled together with plywood and duct tape. These sports were fueled by suburban boredom, teenage frustration, and a fierce DIY spirit that rejected authority and structure. Kids weren't interested in joining a soccer team with uniforms and whistles. They wanted to build a ramp in their cul-de-sac and launch themselves off it, maybe break a bone in the process, but definitely look cool doing it. Then, suddenly, this raw energy, once the stuff of backyard legends and grainy VHS tapes, was being piped into living rooms across America via ESPN. There were booming industrial soundtracks blaring over montages of backflips and crashes. There were slick highlight reels, dramatic commentary, and corporate sponsorships from brands like Mountain Dew that had managed to package rebellion in a neon green can. What had started as the pastime of the outsider was now being celebrated in prime time. It was risky, loud, rebellious, and now profitable. But the heart of it remained unchanged. The draw wasn't fame or trophies, it was the feeling of pure autonomy. You didn't need a coach yelling at you from the sidelines or a playbook filled with X's and O's. You just needed a board, a bike, maybe a cheap helmet optional, and most importantly, a complete disregard for safety. You could skate until your knees bled. You could crash your bike into a pile of trash cans and call it a win. There were no rules, no uniforms, no tryouts, just guts and gravity. That unfiltered sense of freedom, of doing it your own way on your own terms, was catnip for teenagers, especially in the 1990s. This was also the last generation that grew up almost entirely offline. Their sense of identity wasn't tied to follower counts or live streams. It was shaped in person, in physical spaces, through scraped shins and stolen street signs. They were the original free-range kids, latchkey veterans with house keys around their necks, parents working late, and hours of unsupervised time to burn. They wandered neighborhoods, rode bikes until sundown, and communicated with each other through walkie-talkies or handwritten notes passed in class. And when they needed a jolt of energy, they reached for Jolt Cola, a sugary, hyper-caffeinated drink that was practically a rite of passage. These teens lived by instinct, not by algorithm. They learned by doing, and often by falling. Unlike traditional sports that demanded structure, uniforms, and adult supervision, this was the Wild West of athletic expression. You didn't need a team, you didn't need permission, you didn't even need a regulation playing field. You just needed a skateboard, a half-decent bike, a patch of pavement, and the willingness to fall repeatedly. That sense of autonomy, that ability to create your own rules and define your own success, was deeply appealing to teenagers in the 90s. Especially to those coming of age at the tail end of the analog era, without the constant surveillance and digital identity management that would later define the 2000s. Free-range rebels, fueled by Jolt Cola and Pop-Tarts, Home Alone by 3:15, and skating by 3:30. But it wasn't just sports where extreme culture took hold. It infiltrated nearly every corner of youth entertainment and consumer goods like a high-octane, sugar-coated tidal wave. TV shows were louder, faster, and more in-your-face than ever before. Cartoon characters didn't just save the day, they shredded it. Storylines were packed with action, mischief, and sarcastic one-liners that practically dripped with attitude. Even the animation styles seemed more jagged and electrified, like someone had spilled a case of energy drinks directly onto the storyboard. Toys weren't just for playing anymore. They were tools of chaos. Everything came with flames, spikes, launching mechanisms, or glow-in-the-dark features that suggested it might actually explode at any moment. Action figures had pumped-up muscles, wild facial expressions, and names that sounded like they were spat out of a monster truck rally. Even dolls got sassier, snarkier, more rebellious, less Tea Party, more Battle Squad. And the packaging? Bright, violent colors, Thunderbolt fonts, random Z's and X's thrown in for extra edge. Opening a toy was less about discovery and more like unleashing a beast. Beverages followed the same path of sensory overload. This was the age when even fruit juice had to scream. Sodas weren't just carbonated, they were charged. Water wasn't just refreshing. It had electrolytes and extreme fruit blast flavor. Snack foods weren't simply tasty. They were zapped, blasted, nuked, or otherwise weaponized into a marketing fever dream. Your gushers weren't enough if they just oozed. They had to burst violently with extreme juice, preferably while a kid with frosted tips did a backflip in the commercial. Marketing departments, especially those targeting the under-18 demographic, were locked in a kind of cultural arms race. Their goal, outshout, outshock, and out-toed the competition. Commercials were louder, faster cut, and more absurd than anything that had come before. They didn't just pitch the product, they attacked you with it. Volume was strategy. Chaos was currency. The implicit message was clear. If it wasn't loud, wild, or extreme, it wasn't worth your time. Even the once peaceful realm of Saturday morning cartoons got dragged into the storm. These weren't the gentle, slow-paced shows of decades past. No, by the late 90s, they were cranked up to 11 with explosive soundtracks, snarky dialogue, and relentless pacing. There was no time to relax. It was a high-speed thrill ride from the moment you turned on the TV until your sugar crash around lunchtime. Every hero had to have edge, every villain had to be ultra-wicked, and every episode had to feel like a showdown at the edge of the world. The more chaotic, the better. The goal wasn't just to have fun, it was to explode with it, to melt your face off with flavor, speed, action, or excitement. Quiet enjoyment was for adults. Kids of the extreme era didn't just play. They conquered, consumed, and obliterated boredom in the loudest way possible. Everything had to be bigger, wilder, and more intense, because in a world saturated with stimulation, only the most extreme could survive. What went hand in hand with the extreme virus was anti-authority. Young people didn't merely push back against authority figures. They dismantled them with mockery, questioned their every motive, and wore their defiance proudly, almost like a fashion statement. Rebellion wasn't just an attitude, it was a cultural currency. Whether it was a high school principal enforcing dress codes, a Sunday school pastor preaching abstinence, a TV news anchor reporting with polished detachment, or even the President of the United States standing behind a podium, No one was off limits. Every figure of authority was viewed with a healthy dose of suspicion and often a full-blown eye roll. For teenagers of Generation X and the first wave of millennials, cynicism wasn't a phase. It was a survival mechanism. The default reaction to anyone selling guidance, morality, or the path to a white picket-fenced future was to scoff and reach for another copy of Zine Scene or Maximum Rock and Roll. But this deeply ingrained anti-authority streak didn't just materialize out of nowhere. It was forged in the shadow of global anxiety and domestic tension. These were kids raised under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation during the Cold War, when duck and cover drills were still an echo in school hallways, and morning TV brought images of collapsing Soviet regimes. They grew up watching parents grapple with Reaganomics and trickle-down promises that didn't quite trickle. They watched televangelists fall from grace, conservative politicians decrying MTV while quietly involved in scandals of their own, and a culture war being waged over music lyrics and video game violence. The moral majority's grip on American life was loosening, but not before leaving its fingerprints on everything from school textbooks to primetime television. By the time the 1990s took hold, a generation had already been conditioned to look sideways at every sermon, sales pitch, and so-called family value. Naturally, pop culture didn't just mirror that mood, it turned the volume all the way up. Shows like Beavis and Butthead didn't just mock authority, they delighted in the absurdity of it. These two slack-jawed avatars of underachievement giggled at everything from violence to sex ed videos, until their antics sparked real-world controversy and got Fire temporarily banned from the show's dialogue. Even cartoon characters became anti-heroes. Bart Simpson, with his spiky hair and eternal detention slips, became the poster child of suburban disobedience. His catchphrase, "Eat my shorts," wasn't just a punchline. It was a mission statement for disillusioned teens who saw hypocrisy in every institution, from school boards to Congress. Meanwhile, MTV's Liquid Television offered a visual buffet of the bizarre and grotesque, a fever dream of animation that felt like it had crawled out of a punk zine and onto cable TV. It didn't care if you understood it. It only asked that you be weird enough to try. Daria, MTV's painfully relatable teenage misanthrope, captured the inner monologue of millions of teens who felt like they didn't fit in, didn't want to fit in, and probably had better taste in music than you anyway. Her deadpan delivery and thick-rimmed glasses became the unofficial uniform of intellectual rebellion, especially for girls who were sick of being told to smile more. In music, the louder and angrier, the better. The decade thrived on distortion, rebellion, and the sound of amplifiers pushed to their breaking point. Grunge wasn't just a fashion trend, it was a full-body shrug at the American dream, a middle finger to glossy hair metal bands and the corporate optimism of the 80s. Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains didn't sing about falling in love or living happily ever after. They sang about disillusionment, mental exhaustion, and the quiet panic of being young in a world that didn't make sense. Kurt Cobain turned apathy into poetry. Eddie Vedder turned restlessness into sermons. And Chris Cornell sang like he was exorcising an entire generation's ghosts. The Pacific Northwest became the capital of musical despair, and the flannel uniforms spread across the country like an emotional weather pattern. Beyond the grunge scene, its lyrical content opened up a world of pain that no one in the past was either willing or able to talk about. Listen to the album Siamese Dream by the Smashing Pumpkins, and you'll hear 62 minutes of Billy Corgan venting about his abusive childhood, with lyrics crammed with fear, terror, anger, bitterness, hopelessness, suicidal idealism, and the concept that taking a beating from your dad or getting thrown down the stairs by your stepmom was just something routine that you kept quiet outside the house. Songs like Quiet, Today, Space Boy, and Disarm essentially said out loud what many kids growing up in silent abuse at home were thinking. But this time, unlike in the childhood of Billy Corgan and Kurt Cobain in the 1970s, they were going to speak out themselves. No more hiding in silent, dark corners of the bedroom waiting for the next round of bruises. This was a call for action in musical form, with Cobain's guttural scream from Seattle and Corgan's nasal cry from Chicago, supported by layers upon layers of guitars. Even the world of kids wasn't safe from controversy. Parents, still reeling from the satanic panic of the 80s, found new targets to fear. Pokémon, a harmless Japanese cartoon about cute creatures, was suddenly accused of being satanic because evolution was part of its game mechanics. Teletubbies, a pastel fever dream meant for toddlers, sparked outrage because one of the characters, Tinky Winky, carried a purse, with adults being convinced it was an attempt to corrupt children and to promote homosexual undertones and acceptance. Mortal Kombat, with its pixelated decapitations, was blamed for inspiring violence, leading to congressional hearings about video game morality. And then there was Marilyn Manson, the shock rock poster boy who terrified suburban parents. He was blamed for everything from bad grades to the breakdown of Western civilization. The more the media warned against him, the more CDs he sold. The 1990s were one long tug of war between the youth and the moral watchdogs who just couldn't keep up. Every time adults tried to sanitize culture, teenagers found a darker corner to occupy. College campuses became the intellectual battlegrounds of this culture war. One side marched for justice, diversity, and awareness. The other mocked them for being too serious or too sensitive. The word politically correct went from being an academic term to a punchline. Films like PCU skewered campus activism with stoner humor, while Fight Club went in for the kill, channeling male alienation into literal underground fistfights against capitalism, conformity, and IKEA catalogs. Both films said the same thing in different ways. Nobody believed in the system anymore, and everyone was searching for something real beneath all the noise. Meanwhile, daytime television became a sideshow of dysfunction. Jerry Springer ruled the airwaves with episodes titled things like "My Sister Slept with My Fiancé" or "You're Not My Baby's Daddy." The guests shouted, fought, and cried, while the audience cheered like it was Roman gladiator combat. Decorum wasn't just dying. It was being strangled with a folding chair. People who had grown up with Walter Cronkite and Mr. Rogers now flipped channels to watch everyday Americans throw punches over infidelity. It was entertainment, chaos, and social commentary all at once. The truth is, the 90s weren't as apolitical as they sometimes seemed. People weren't apathetic. They were exhausted. They had watched the promises of the Reagan era collapse, the Cold War end without peace, and corporate greed rise in its place. They were done pretending the system worked. Government, church, school, none of it felt trustworthy anymore. So instead of fixing it, people mocked it. Irony became armor. Sarcasm turned into survival. Late-night talk shows, stand-up comics, and sitcoms all thrived on the same tone. Detached, jaded, clever enough to laugh at the absurdity of it all. But of course, like most things soaked in caffeine and covered in fake flames, Extreme burned hot and flamed out fast, though anti-authority continued to march on, and does so to this day in flip-flopping forms both left and right of the political spectrum. By the early 2000s, the whole Extreme act was starting to wear thin. What began as a clever marketing strategy had become a parody of itself. The irony that once gave it punch had curdled into something hollow. Jackass came along and pushed the absurdity to its natural limits. Guys getting launched into bushes and shopping carts, stapling things to their bodies, and calling it entertainment. The joke wasn't on extreme culture, it was extreme culture, just without the pretense. At the same time, energy drinks started flooding convenience store shelves. Every can looked like it was designed by a tattoo artist trapped inside a monster truck rally. Flames, skulls, sharp fonts, growling slogans. It was too much. The aesthetic of overload reached a saturation point. Then, on September 11th, 2001, 4 hijacked airliners swept through the sky and crashed into the very heart of American society, culture, and enthusiasm. For the laid-back, slacker-based, extreme culture of the previous decade, it was tilt. Game over. In the post-9/11 world, wide-eyed enthusiasm wasn't enough anymore. Having sat there in your classrooms, your living rooms, your offices, and watched live the Twin Towers get knocked down by terrorists using commercial jets, any semblance that the world could be a carefree place of enthusiasm, fun, adventure, limitless potential, and no holds barred vanished instantly. How could anyone come back from that? How could anyone wake up in the morning after seeing what they saw and believed with even a single fiber of their being that we could return to the day before and pretend it never happened, no matter how much we craved it? People craved depth, or at least something that felt heavier. The collective mood turned, and Extreme, with its goofball fonts and caffeinated slogans, felt like a relic from another world. Eventually, the extreme trend faded into the background, leaving behind a trail of torn-up skate shoes, lime green soda cans, and a generation of adults who still flinch when someone screams, "To the max!" unironically. The marketing may have disappeared, but the muscle memory of it stuck. Anyone who lived through that time can still hear the guitar riffs and crash zooms of every other commercial. It's in the DNA of an entire demographic, now older, maybe wiser, but still oddly sentimental about how hard everything used to try to be cool. For a few wild years, extreme was more than just a slogan. It was a cultural shorthand, a hyperactive mood, a middle finger to subtlety. It was ridiculous, loud, performative, often annoying, and totally unforgettable. Because if you were a teenager in the 90s, doing anything less than extreme didn't just seem boring. It felt like you were missing out on the main event.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199 on X, we're here just for you.